So, Lone Rider here. And if you're like me, you remember the 1990s and you remember a movie that came out called Disturbing Behavior. Disturbing Behavior actually was a sci fi slash, some people consider it a horror movie. I'm not sure I would, but it was a sci fi suspense film that dealt with a young man and his sister moving into a small town and discovering that there were serious shenanigans afoot, including the brainwashing of some of his friends and colleagues in order to attempt to social engineer them. People have made comparisons, usually unfavorably, to films like The Stepford Wives. The truth is that I think it stands on its own as its own film, and it's one of those films that you either really like or hate. I happen to like it. But what I do want to suggest here is the possibility that Disturbing Behavior is actually part of the X-Files universe. Now, the X-Files was on TV at the same time and dealt with many of the same themes. And while there is explicitly no crossover, Mulder and Scully don't make an appearance, neither do any of the other supporting characters, I want to consider that perhaps there are things afoot that would lead one to believe that the film is actually part of the same universe. We have the fact that it takes place on the West Coast. Now, if you're familiar with the X-Files, you know that a lot of the early episodes, the ones that people remember most fondly, were usually filmed and set in many of the same areas. They were filmed mostly in Canada, but on the West Coast, and you had the same sort of atmosphere because of basically the same location. One of the things you also had was the same sort of atmosphere in terms of the suspense. Throughout this movie, there's a suggestion that strange events are afoot, and yet the main character does not want to believe that they are afoot, does not want to believe that what's going on is what's actually going on. And throughout the course of the movie, he is forced to reevaluate that, and he is forced to basically come to grips with the fact that there is a conspiracy, cabal, whatever you want to call it, that he has to deal with. And he finds an ally in a fellow classmate, and they do try and deal with it. He also finds an ally in one of the staff members, the janitor, who is more than he seems. And this will be a familiar aspect to those of you who watch The X-Files. A lot of the supporting characters, for example, Assistant Director Skinner, at the same time, he started out, you were ambivalent about his character. Was he on their side? Was he not on their side? And as the show moved on, it became quite clear that he actually was on their side. He was just walking a thin line because he had to coexist within the overall organization and yet take their side at the same time. So I honestly think that although there's no overt crossover and no overt link, except for the overall atmosphere and some of the themes being the same, that it is quite possible that this does exist in the X-Files universe, the same universe as the X-Files, as it were. In that sense, I also want to throw in one more thing. It was directed by David Nutter, who worked on the X-Files, as well as several of these, many other films that were going on at the time. What's more interesting, it's not just that it was directed by David Nutter, it's also that Mark Snow did the score. And if you're familiar with the X-Files, Mark Snow is the guy who came up with the iconic score and theme song for the X-Files. So I think it's quite possible that this exists in the X-Files universe in a sort of macro sense. Of course, it's its own standalone film, and there's no overt links. But if you're like me and you're a big sci-fi fan and you're a big fan of the X-Files and a lot of the stuff that was coming out at that time, including this film, it is interesting to ponder, is this actually part of the overall X-Files universe? And while, like I said, there's no explicit links, I think there's enough stuff going on, including the fact that both David Nutter and Mark Snow are involved, that you have to wonder if perhaps within the X-Files overall universe, maybe this was an incident that could have been an episode, except the agents never got to investigate it. We do actually know there were X-Files episodes that dealt with similar themes. Wet Wired and Blood both dealt with people essentially being brainwashed as a form of social engineering. and the unintended consequences that resulted. And that's essentially the identical theme here. Could it be that you know the episode the episodes of the X-Files that dealt with those themes, that they were basically picking up where this left off? Could be. We do know that, spoiler alert, at the end of this film, many of the brainwashed characters are killed, but not all. And it is quite possible that they went on to other towns and other places. Could some of them have perhaps ended up in places where the X-Files ended up going? I don't know. But I do think that it's interesting to ponder if, this actually should be considered an extension of the X-Files universe or a part of it. And like I said, just a fun little speculation from, somebody who's a sort of a sci-fi fan and definitely was a fan of a lot of the stuff that was coming out at the time, including both the X-Files and this film. So there you go. Disturbing Behavior, was it part of the X-Files universe? Is it part of the X-Files universe? I'd kind of like to think it is. Lone Rider out.